Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we are diving right into some pretty major developments in this whole U.S.-China trade war thing.
Yeah.
As of April 2025.
Yeah.
We've got a whole bunch of news reports, expert analysis, the whole deal. And what we really want to do today is help you guys make sense of it all.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, what are these latest tariff hikes that we're seeing? How is China reacting? What could they do to hit back?
Right.
And what does this all mean for the bigger picture, global trade, the whole shebang?
Yeah, absolutely. And
So we're going to cut through all the noise and focus on what actually matters here.
Yeah, I think what's so striking right now is just how fast this thing is escalating. I mean, it's really a rapid-fire situation, and I think understanding that sequence of events is going to be really crucial for everyone out there to really grasp, what the potential fallout could be for global trade.
Okay, so let's rewind a little bit, because even before this past week, weren't there already some tariffs in place? Like we had that 34% tariff on a bunch of different Chinese imports, right? And then there was that other one, the 20% tariff specifically targeting fentanyl trafficking.
Yeah.
And of course, China had already slapped back with their own 34% retaliatory tariffs.
Exactly. So that's kind of the backdrop that we're dealing with here. And now the thing that seems to have really kicked off this whole new wave of tension is President Trump's announcement on Monday, April 7th.
Right, that Truth Social post that kind of sent shockwaves through everything.
Yeah, exactly.
He basically threw down the gauntlet.
Or he did.
Said he'd add another 50% tariff on all Chinese imports unless China backed down from their retaliatory tariffs by Tuesday, April 8th. I mean, talk about an ultimatum.
It's a huge ultimatum. And I think what people need to understand is the combined effect here. I mean, if that extra 50% actually kicks in on Wednesday, April 9th.
Oh, wow.
We're looking at a total of 104% in tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the U.S. That's a massive price shock potentially for American consumers. I mean, think about all the stuff we buy, right?
I mean, that is a crazy number.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about the tariffs either. Right? Trump also made it clear that all talks with China about those meetings they were asking for.
Yeah.
All that's off the table now.
Right.
Sounds like he's shutting down any chance of negotiation anytime soon.
It really does. And, if you connect this to the broader picture, this really fits with that whole Liberation Day trade war rhetoric that President Trump's been using, right? He sees these tariffs as this necessary tool to finally fix what he views as this long-standing unfair trade situation.
Right.
And it's interesting, he also mentioned being open to trade talks with Japan and Israel, which suggests maybe a shift in priorities or alliances,
Interesting.
Yeah.
So how did China respond to all of this? I mean, they couldn't have been happy.
No, not at all. China's Commerce Ministry came out swinging. They basically vowed to fight to the end and said they'd take whatever countermeasures were necessary to protect their interests.
Yeah, they didn't mince words either, calling the U.S. tariffs completely groundless. And the whole thing a typical unilateral bullying practice. That's some pretty strong language right there.
Yeah, it is. And they were very deliberate in framing their own potential countermeasures as completely legitimate, saying that they're all about protecting their own sovereignty, their security, their development goals, and also upholding the international trade order as a whole. So they're presenting themselves as both defending their own interests and also defending global trade norms.
Right. And it wasn't just the Commerce Ministry. We also heard from the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Lin Jian, who seemed pretty skeptical about the U.S. actually wanting any kind of real dialogue.
Yeah.
He stressed that any kind of meaningful talks would have to be based on equality, mutual respect, mutual benefit.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like they're holding their breath, waiting for a resolution anytime soon.
Not really, no. And it's worth mentioning that even Hong Kong's chief executive, John Lee, came out condemning the tariffs as bullying and said that Hong Kong would be looking to integrate its economy even more closely with mainland China's development. So this shows how these tensions are rippling outwards beyond just the U.S. and mainland China.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, with all of this going on, this crazy back and forth, it's got to be causing some serious jitters in the global financial markets, right? Like I was reading about some pretty big stock market swings.
Oh, absolutely. But the immediate reaction to these announcements was huge instability in the global stock markets, and Asian markets in particular took a big hit. Some reports even said it was one of their worst days in a while. So it's clear that analysts and traders are really worried about the potential for this damaging global trade war that could really hurt investment and economic growth.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just about those abstract market movements either, right? Like, what about the real world impact on everyday people?
Yep.
Like consumers here in the U.S., for example.
That's the key question, right? Because higher tariffs usually mean higher prices for consumers. The cost of importing goods goes up, And businesses often pass those costs on to us, the shoppers. So think about it. We're talking about a huge range of products here. Electronics like iPhones, computers, household stuff, toys, so many things that are heavily reliant on manufacturing in China. So American consumers could very well end up paying more for all sorts of things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And on the flip side, could China try to offset some of the damage by finding new markets for their products?
Yeah, that's a very real possibility. Experts are suggesting that China might try to ramp up exports to other big markets, like the European Union, for instance. So European consumers might start seeing more competitively priced Chinese goods, but it could also create new problems for domestic producers in those markets who suddenly have to compete with these cheaper imports.
Right, yeah. So it's kind of this ripple effect,
Exactly.
It's interesting to think about how these, big picture trade disputes actually play out on the ground in China.
Yeah.
Like, what are people's reactions over there? We did get some insights into that, didn't we?
We did, yeah. In Beijing, the mood seemed to be a bit mixed. We heard from Wu Qi, a construction worker, who said he was worried, but also had faith that China could weather the storm. He saw this whole thing as more about Trump's own interests than anything else, and that kind of national resilience and determination is a common thread. You see it in how some parts of the population view these situations.
Right, but then you have the business owners,
Yeah.
the people who are actually dealing with the consequences of these tariffs firsthand.
Absolutely. And we heard from Paul Wang, who owns a business selling stainless steel accessories. He's already being proactive, actually shifting his focus to the European market because he's anticipating those U.S. tariffs going way up.
Right.
And then there were Jesse Huang and Yang Aijia, who import chemicals from the U.S., and their situation is much more uncertain. They're actually worried about their businesses closing down and having to lay off employees. It's a really stark reminder of the human cost and the immediate economic anxiety that these trade disputes can create.
Yeah, for sure. So let's say China does decide to retaliate further. What are some of the things they could actually do? Like, what's in their arsenal, so to speak?
Well, according to trade experts, China has a few options. They could suspend or scale back their cooperation with the U.S. on fighting fentanyl trafficking, which is a huge issue here in the States.
Right.
They could also impose tougher quotas or restrictions on agricultural imports from the U.S., which would directly impact American farmers. Another area they might target is the U.S. trade in services within China, things like finance, legal services hitting those industries operating in China. And then we also heard about the possibility of China allowing its currency, the yuan, to weaken. Can you explain how that would work?
Yeah, how would that play into all of this?
Sure. So if the yuan depreciates or becomes less valuable compared to the US dollar, it basically makes Chinese exports cheaper for buyers using dollars. So even with those higher tariffs, the actual price increase for American importers might be somewhat balanced out by the weaker yuan. And on the flip side, it would make US goods more expensive for Chinese buyers. So it's a tool they could use to try and stay competitive despite the tariffs. And then there's also the possibility of state-linked enterprises stepping in to buy up stocks on the Chinese stock market if things get really volatile as a way to try and stabilize the market.
So it's kind of like this high-stakes game of economic chess, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It makes you wonder about the bigger picture. Where is all of this headed? What are the experts saying about how this might ultimately play out?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Mary Lovely from the Peterson Institute for International Economics put it really well. She called it a game of who can bear more pain. The feeling is that both sides are willing to put up with some economic hardship to get what they want. Andrew Collier from Harvard Kennedy School pointed out that the Chinese economy is already facing some challenges, and these tariffs could make things worse, potentially putting pressure on President Xi.
And the thing is, the two economies are so deeply interconnected, right?
Oh, absolutely. Deborah Elms from the Hinrich Foundation really emphasized that just how intertwined the U.S. and Chinese economies are. It's not just about the flow of goods. It's about investment, digital trade data, all of that. She pointed out that there are so many ways the situation could escalate beyond just these tariffs on physical goods. And Roland Raja at the Lowy Institute highlighted the huge uncertainty we're dealing with. He said that China has a wide toolkit of potential responses. So it's really hard to predict exactly how they'll retaliate or to what extent.
Right. And we also can't forget that the U.S. has been running a pretty significant trade deficit with China for a while now. I think in 2024, the value of goods we imported from China was way higher than what we exported to them.
Yeah, that trade imbalance is a big part of why the U.S. is pushing these tariffs in the first place. They want to shrink that gap.
Makes sense.
And to add another layer of complexity to all of this, there are reports that President Trump hasn't actually spoken directly with President Xi Jinping since he got back into the White House, even though China has apparently signaled that they're open to talks. So this lack of high-level communication during this whole escalation is pretty significant.
Yeah, definitely. So our sources also mentioned a couple other developments that seem kind of unrelated, but might give us some broader context, something about discussions with Iran and a legal case.
Right. So while everyone's focused on this trade war with China, there were reports about some planned indirect talks between Iran and the U.S. and Oman about Iran's nuclear program, even though President Trump said direct talks were already happening. And then separately, there's this legal battle going on in Washington, D.C. about the Alien Enemies Act, which involves some actions taken by the Trump administration. So these are separate issues, but they do show how complex and unpredictable the global political landscape is right now.
Definitely. So looking beyond this immediate back and forth, what are some of the bigger long-term changes we might see if this trade war keeps escalating?
Well, the long-term implications could be pretty huge. We could see a real weakening of the U.S.-China trade relationship, with China looking to build stronger economic ties with other major players like the European Union. We could also see Chinese exports being diverted more towards markets in Southeast Asia and other regions, which could lead to more competition there. And this whole situation is probably going to speed up the restructuring of global supply chains as companies try to reduce their reliance on either the U.S. or China to minimize risk.
So, we've heard the term decoupling thrown around when people talk about the U.S. and China. Is that a realistic outcome in the long run?
A complete decoupling of the two economies would be incredibly complex and disruptive for both sides.
Yep.
But a move towards more separation in certain key sectors is definitely a possibility. I think what's more likely is a future with a more fragmented global trade system where we see different economic blocs and alliances emerging. And ultimately, our sources really highlight how uncertain this whole thing is, how this trade war will end up, and whether it could shift the balance of global economic power even further.
Right. It's like that whole butterfly effect thing.
Yeah.
One small change can have huge consequences down the line.
Exactly.
So to sum up where we are as of today, April 8th, 2025, we're in the thick of this rapidly escalating trade war between the U.S. and China.
Yeah.
This latest wave was triggered by these new major tariff threats from the U.S., and China's come back strong, condemning those threats and promising to retaliate. And the potential consequences are huge, not just for the U.S. and China, but for global trade and consumers everywhere.
Yeah, and I think what's really striking is just how fast and how big this latest escalation has been. It really shows how fragile the global trade environment is right now.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about how interconnected everything really is.
Yeah.
How could these trade disputes end up affecting things beyond just economics? What about international relations, geopolitical stability, even cultural exchanges down the line? It really makes you think about whose analysis of all this you find most convincing and what assumptions you're bringing to the table. That's something to really chew on after this deep dive.
Yeah, lots to think about for sure.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
You too.